Welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
All right, guys, I'm back to talk to you guys about another essay I've been working on, and I'm excited to introduce you guys to my friend, Vaughn Thompson, who's here. He's zooming in from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
Yep,
So,
that's right.
Vaughn and I had late night conversations at the college we both went to, Multnomah Bible College. Today it's Multnomah University. We were just reminiscing before we hit record of our time there, and we haven't had a chance to really connect since. So this is really exciting. Vaughn and I are getting to reconnect, and we're going to dive right into a very dark topic. I'm gonna talk to you guys about something that I don't know. So I think this is a big deal, though. We really need to understand this, and this is something I've been wrestling through and wanted to get, sort of Vaughn's reaction to this idea. So the essay I wrote is called "Is Misplaced Compassion at the Root of Mass Atrocities?" All right, guys. So hopefully you're in a place right now where you can think about something rather deep and intense. But this is what I was thinking through. It says, today we have a hard time agreeing on what is good, but there's a large consensus on what evil looks like, and we can summarize it in a single word: Nazi. In today's moral framework, Nazis are the demons, death camps are hell, and Hitler is the devil. I got that from somebody, but I don't know who, so I can't attribute it to them, but I think that's a really important observation. And if Nazis represent ultimate evil, then being the opposite of a Nazi, someone who would have risked one's life to rescue those being sent to death camps, would put one on the side of moral virtue, on the right side of history. But do we really know what kind of person would have been an anti-Nazi in Hitler's Germany? How can I look into my heart, evaluate my current actions, and discover if I'm cultivating the kind of moral virtue that would have put me on the right side of that historical moment? I want to suggest two theories. The first, which is highly intuitive but dangerously flawed, and the other, which is counterintuitive but I believe is closer to the truth. Okay, theory number one. Someone today who feels a great deal of compassion for oppressed groups is the kind of person who would have been an anti-Nazi. That's the first theory. This theory immediately makes sense to most of us. What the Nazis were lacking was common human decency, and this lack of compassion and empathy is what gives rise to someone to go along with these kinds of atrocities. What's wrong with this theory? How can any compassionate person agree to the horrors committed by so many of the people in Hitler's Germany? What this theory lacks is an understanding that compassion cuts two ways, not just one. Compassion can cause you to risk your life to save someone, but it can also cause you to risk your life to destroy someone who you believe is hurting the object of your compassion. In other words, compassion can be easily weaponized. This is what is missing in most of our understanding of what happened in Germany. A friend of mine whose family was from Germany asked, what would you expect the Germans to do when their children were starving and they believed it was caused by the selfish corruption of German Jews? People driven by compassion are still at the mercy of the narratives they can be convinced to believe that define the victim and perpetrator. In fact, a moral framework founded on compassion can inadvertently turn you so vehemently against the perceived oppressor that you could find yourself going along with a movement that results in atrocities. This caused ordinary people in Germany, Russia, and China to go along with genocides as long as it was aimed at a group the state propaganda deemed as oppressors. We see this theme emerging again in our day. Narratives are being spun which place people into neat groupings of victims and oppressors. Those who reflexively want to be on the side of the oppressed can adopt beliefs that dehumanize these oppressor groups. Is this the hidden seedbed of a future atrocity? If it's not compassion for oppressed groups that would create an anti-Nazi in Hitler's Germany, what would? Okay, here's theory number two. Someone who has unshakable faith in the sacred value of each individual. In the face of overwhelming propaganda and peer pressure to believe your group is being attacked and victimized by an oppressor, What stops someone from going along with destroying the oppressor out of compassion for the oppressed? I only know of one thing: a pre-existing commitment to the sacred value of every life, even the life of the oppressor. In other words, the easiest way to discover if you would be a Nazi is to ask how you would want the individuals to be treated who are in the group you see as the worst oppressors in your society, especially if you see your group as being their victims. If you would want every member of that group to receive fair and just treatment, if you'd be willing to risk your life to ensure members of that oppressor group would receive that just treatment, then there's a good chance you would have the moral courage and the principled framework to have been an anti-Nazi in Hitler's Germany. If this theory reflects reality, it leads to a surprising conclusion. What would ensure that crimes against humanity never happen again is not empathy, but faith, specifically faith in the sacred value of every individual human life and the desire for justice to be given to every human being, not at the level of the group, but at the level of the individual. All right, so that's kind of the thought or the theories that have been stirring up. I'm curious what is that? How did that strike you, Vaughn? Any reactions?
Fascinating. So just a little background about me. Jeremy, fascinating to me. You and I have both had some parallel journey in some regard, both after our shared experience in college and then going off to seminary. And following that, I made a shift into the business world. So, and interestingly enough, I've kind of gone back and forth between working in marketing as well as finance. And I've been a foreign exchange currency trader for several years. And so I've been an observer, I think, of global macro movements, especially economic movements, professionally for quite some time. And so when I approach like politics, social movements, and things like that, as an observer, it's come to me really because I'm looking at how does that move economics and a whole host of global type stuff. I really appreciated your insight there, because one of the things that struck me is that how powerful narratives are. Narratives and storytelling are moving the world right now. And a lot of the battles that we see in tremendous violence that just happens because of narratives,
Right.
And so the real wars that are happening in our world today aren't, in part, they are over things like natural resources and stuff like that. But a big part of this is the battle for narrative,
Yes.
and I think we see that in our country right now,
Yeah.
is a people posturing, our politicians, they're posturing to be able to, in conjunction with the media, to have a narrative that moves people in a certain direction, or
Right.
moves the country in a certain direction.
Yes. Well, those narratives seem to be specifically attempting to, number one, sort of put people in these groupings of sort of moral virtue. It's, you got the victim and the oppressor. That's sort of the main overarching narrative, and then underneath that, what it means to be virtuous is to have compassion and empathy for the right group.
Right.
And so that all makes sense to us. It makes us immediately feel morally virtuous, which it's a need we all have. And so, I think people are being torn between basically being on both sides of, we both are trying to craft these narratives like you're describing, but we're not sort of, there's another move that I'm advocating for, which is to say that we all need to be really humble about those narratives, and that there's something that needs to transcend the narratives themselves. And what I find really, really worrying is when the narratives become the highest dominant thing, as opposed to, and this to me is the brilliant way that, like, for example, the Constitution was formed, which was to say, we don't live just in a democracy. We live in a democracy that has a constitution that you cannot, that the majority no matter what narratives they spin, cannot violate the rights of specific individuals around these amendments or these specific elements of what is which these truths we hold to be self-evident. And so, but what's happening in our day is I think the narratives are actually now starting to overcome those ideas, and sort of that overarching narrative that says that there are sacred rights that individuals have. And when I think about like this wrestling with atrocity, it's really because these narratives, I think that the first thing you need to look for is when the opposed group, whether you're on the left or the right, whatever group you're opposing gets dehumanized. That's the ultimate move. Because as soon as you can call them vermin, or you can, and so I always listen really carefully to people when they are describing their opponents. And as soon as they start using dehumanizing language, which happens, by the way, all the time, please, you guys listen for this. It's possible to say, I disagree with that group, but I honor them as people. And I honor their rights as individuals to be able to be treated in a fair and just way, versus just painting them all with a dehumanizing brush. So I don't know if you've seen that to me is a really worrying trend, that we're not looking for that specifically.
It's huge. It is a huge trend. And in a lot of ways, when we watch it happen over and over again, it enculturates society and people, just to put some skin on this, to do the same and replicate it, because that's what our media does and stuff like that. And and then people replicate that in public conversation when you go to a restaurant or a bar or something, and you have a conversation with your neighbor, even church people, unfortunately, they replicate the practices of dehumanization for castigating the other.
Yes.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
Well, and I think what's really frustrating about that, when it happens like you just described in the church, the thing that's really interesting about it, so I described like the Constitution gives us this framework. Obviously, the Bible, that starts with the very, very first chapter of the Bible that says that every single human being is created in the image of God. Every single human life is sacred, and has this incredible value that transcends whatever their particular actions. Then we have the power of the gospel, where Jesus literally dies for his enemies, and asks for their forgiveness. We have the theological grounding to make sure that we never make this mistake. And this is why I find people like Bonhoeffer in Germany, during Hitler's Germany, so inspiring, because he demonstrated that there is truth in the scriptures that would have inoculated people from the propaganda machine that was coming out of Germany. And again, I think it's so important. I think probably the most important thing I'm trying to get across in this article that I feel like I see, I think people, there is a lot of conversation around the value of the individual. The thing that I really am concerned about is the idea that compassion is the highest value. I think that idea that is at the root of the atrocity itself is not an idea I've heard many people talk about. And I think that it's very counterintuitive. It's like compassion is always good. I had a friend of mine that I was having coffee with recently, and he said, I am always on the side of the oppressor. And I almost gasped. I'm like, that is the definition of somebody who can be weaponized against another group, right? Because now the battle is purely the narrative battle. I can get you and millions of people who have that same idea to absolutely denigrate and attack and do almost anything against that oppressor group. If I can just get the narrative right and convince you that you are on the side of the victim. I don't think people know that.
No, And as a Christian, we think what could be better, more important than compassion,
Right.
you know.
Yes.
So that's a fascinating look at how Christians need to get their narrative right. um, I know this is work that you've done in the past and stuff that you've thought about, but I think that what's missing here is, if for Christians in trying to get their narrative right, is I think the church largely has forgotten that they're exiles.
Yeah. Oh
That
yeah. Talk about
they
that.
they are an exilic people,
Yeah.
and so that means that you have to be intentional about crafting practices and getting your story straight,
Yeah.
or you're going to just adopt the narrative and the stories and practices of the empire.
Yes.
You know,
100%. Yeah. I
yeah.
think that identity that we are exiles who've essentially
Hmm.
been sent into cultures that we know
Hmm.
are going to be at war with each other. We
Right.
know that there's going to be these two narratives that are going to spin up in every culture this happens.
Yep.
And what's the really remarkable thing is that the Constitution and this sort of experiment in democracy has really put the lid on a lot of the violence. We did go through a civil war. It's not perfect. We could go through more violence and more upheaval. But as exiles and ambassadors from another kingdom, we really represent a totally different, and I would say, yeah, a totally different way of viewing these things. And that is what's really frustrating when people, in the name of compassion, become enmeshed with the narratives of the culture that they are supposed to be ambassadors to, as opposed to enmeshed in. And so you have to stay above that stuff. You have to say, look, I get why you both are doing this.
Hmm.
There's a cyclical pattern to this idea, and it's going to get worse. And so there's several things that we can do as believers to keep us away from getting enmeshed in this. One is what you just said. Our identity cannot be, we cannot ground our identity in one of these two groups.
And it
Or
can't
five.
be co-opted either
Yes.
from, and that's a temptation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Like there's ways in which that's being attempted to be done, and that's never
Hmm.
going to be a good. There's lots of good reasons to get co-opted, but there's ultimately, this is why I mean by like these intuitive and counterintuitive sort of thoughts, is that it's you're gonna hear incredibly good arguments for why you should join one of these groups. Those
It's true.
arguments are still not going. It's so important that you understand that, like, your identity is sort of what keeps you from falling into one of those traps.
Hmm.
You can say, look, I kind of do agree with this side or that side for the most part, or generally speaking, but look, my job is to be salt and light in this world.
Hmm.
I'm an exile. I'm from a different kingdom. And so
Hmm.
I oftentimes, to do this, I go through the mental exercise of imagining when I find myself getting a little bit politically enmeshed in our culture. I always put myself in the position of, if I were a missionary and I were being sent to a foreign country, maybe in the Middle East, and I ran into a similar dynamic where there was groups that were, putting forth various political opinions, and I found myself, for the most part, sort of siding with one. Would I then take on that identity as primary all of a sudden and begin to join that side and fight against the other? I couldn't imagine doing that with the identity of a missionary. I would stay above it because I would never know when I might want to reach out to somebody from that. And I probably would also understand that there are good arguments on both sides. I may, for the most part, like I said, it's okay to find yourself agreeing more often with one side. The problem is, again, it's the identity problem. Your job is not to is you belong to another kingdom. You're a citizen of another country. So yeah, I find that really helpful to sort of stay outside of that enmeshment.
I love the way you put that. It falls in the category of you've got one job.
Yes. Yeah. What's primary? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Got to keep that in mind. And I think that this be aware that, like, so the number one emotion that Jesus showed in the Gospels, particularly in Mark, was compassion. And so it's really important to understand that compassion is a core part of what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be a Jesus follower. That we do need to exercise compassion and empathy, but to realize that that compassion and empathy can be weaponized against people that are seen as this out group, and that we are all very susceptible. our human software is incredibly susceptible to that kind of propaganda. And so we've talked about, one thing is to be careful that you have an identity grounded in an exile and as a citizen of another country. I think another thing is to recognize that we have a narrative that is above compassion, which is we have to treat every individual as sacred. And that's one of the things that makes us very unique in every society. That's part of what causes us to be salt and light. So don't give in to dehumanizing language or narratives or thoughts. Even like, be aware that if you begin to see that side as just like a caricature as opposed to real human beings. And I think the last thing, and this is the thing I really wrestled with in the essay, was, what do you do if the whole society just gets in absolute uproar and decides that this oppressor group just needs to be stamped out? The only way for you to stand up against that, and this happened in Germany, is to be willing to risk your life for people you think are oppressors. I mean, the people that stood up for the Jews, there were groups of people that loved the Jews in Hitler's Germany and really saw through the propaganda. But the people that I find even more remarkable are the people who didn't see through the propaganda, but they have this pre-existing faith commitment in the sacredness of the individual, because then risk their lives to try to stand up for that which is most sacred, and that is trying to protect these people because they're people, because they're human beings, because they're made in the image of God. And that should have inoculated the entire Christian church in Germany from going along with any of these atrocities. But what would not have inoculated them is a commitment to compassion. I think that's the surprising thing that I'm really trying to grapple with, because as I talk to people, I keep hearing that as the subtext of what would truly make an anti-Nazi, and I think that's just a misunderstanding of how compassion works. So
yeah, that's it's a next level insight for sure, because as you alluded to, compassion can be co-opted, and the next level is that a lot of Christians, people generally, just don't think about that being weaponized.
yeah,
How, like, I have compassion, I'm a better person.
right.
How
It
could that
immediately gives you,
possibly be wrong?
yeah, it immediately gives you a sense of moral superiority. If I'm
Absolutely.
feeling compassion, I know I'm on the right side. And I'm telling you
Yep.
guys, that is not a good instinct. You need to be very careful of that instinct, because
Right.
compassion, if you're using it and you're gaining all that sort of sense of moral virtue from that compassion, that can be used by people who are extremely skilled at crafting narratives to create a vice that is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
And so you have to have something that sort of like an alarm bell that goes off somewhere. And that's kind of what I'm trying to advocate for: alarm bells that go off to say, okay, look, something now needs to take the place of my obsession with my compassion. I need to care more about justice in the situation, or fairness, or the rule of law, or the sacredness of the individual. These are faith commitments. And I say it that way because there's nowhere you're going to be able to find these. As you can't find this hierarchy in nature. There's no way that you're going to be able to somehow discern which of these: justice, compassion, individual rights, freedom. You're not going to be able to figure out which one is higher by studying the natural world. But in Scripture, we do have the kinds of stories and lenses and laws and teachings to give us these insights that the sacredness of the individual is really not to be somehow diminished because our group feels oppressed by their group. Like, we have to resist that impulse, and that's a very human impulse, but it's very dangerous. We have to do the work now before things get more and more heated up.
I honestly keep going back to the identity issue, because narratives generally are always about us versus them, and who sometimes my parents have said in the past, my dad's a Bible professor, and we, like, do you have a mouse in your pocket, or are you French? Who's we? We need to, and it's always stuck with me, because when we as believers say, well, what we need to do, speaking of the country, well, wait a minute, who's we? what we need to do as Christians is be more faithful Christians.
Yeah.
We need to be more enculturated in the story of Scripture, in the story of Jesus Christ, in the story of our redemption, and the redemption of the world. Those should be overpowering narratives for us. Otherwise, we'll just lose our witness and our ability to discern us versus them in the rest of the world. I loved your missionary analogy, because I think that's basically it. And we will lose our witness if we don't get the identity right, and the narrative that goes with it.
Yeah. Well said. Awesome. Well, thanks, Vaughn. This has been really fun to talk to you, and hope you guys, as you listen to this, can I'd love to hear anybody else's feedback as well as you think through. This is a complicated issue. This conversation does not even come close to getting to the depths of it. We scratched the surface, but I really wanted to more alert you guys to this dynamic that I think is really being underreported and understood. So if that's even a way to say it. But thank you guys for listening, and thanks, Vaughn, for talking with me.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.